Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome. Finland is investigating into another mysterious instance of damaged undersea infrastructure after a cable linking its power grid to Estonia, resting cozily at the bottom of the Baltic Sea bed, has been unexpectedly severed by persons unknown. These, to nobody's surprise, may have now turned out to be the crew of a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker, which was boarded by Finnish Coast Guard and sailed into Finnish waters for investigation. And this, of course, raises a number of questions. Is Russia using its Shadow Fleet to wage a shadow war against NATO? How many more strange incidents before decisive steps are taken? And what steps should actually those be? Well, our guest today is Teivo Teivainen, Professor of Politics at the University of Helsinki. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good morning.
So first things first, do you believe this could have been anything else but deliberate action on the part of forces which, well, are not entirely friendly towards NATO countries, to say the least?
Well, as a scholar, I must say many things are possible. The fact that there have been so many incidents in recent times points to a pattern which makes it very unlikely that it would be something else than deliberate sabotage action. But the investigations haven't advanced much yet, so it's difficult to say for sure.
So this is not the first time this has happened. We've had a malfunction of undersea infrastructure before. Also GPS jamming in the Baltic Sea. So now, the major question that has to be asked. If the investigation proves that this, in fact, was the work of Russians, or people hired by the Russians, what should be done about it?
An excellent question. Now Finnish authorities and other authorities are talking a little bit tougher than before, where the aim of possible further operations is not merely to prevent this kind of sabotage from happening, but also to prevent the shadow fleet from functioning. To what extent that is possible, what kinds of legal means there are to take control of vessels, especially in international waters, is still a bit unclear. But the action of Finnish authorities now has been highlighted as a sort of new position, new kind of more determined position to do something about it. There are also discussions about whether NATO Article 4 or something else should be invoked about the repeated sabotage actions or repeated malfunctions in the sea cables.
Because there really seem to be like two ways to go about it. The first one is, like you've mentioned, possibly invoking Article 4, basically calling this an act of thinly veiled aggression and proceeding accordingly. But we've also heard this being called an instance of aggravated vandalism, if I remember correctly. So you can still maintain the illusion that this is not hybrid warfare, but you can still actually take actions, like you said, against the Shadow Fleet. Thing is, how is it possible to stop the Shadow Fleet from operating entirely in the Baltic? Because we also have freedom of navigation, so you can actually have sanctions targeting individual ships, but Russia will be bringing more of those, right? So it's going to be this whack-a-mole kind of game, possibly going on endlessly.
Yes, and one problem is that the ownership structures are often quite murky, interlocking ownership mechanisms and networks. So for the sanctions, it's not always easy to know who the owner that should be sanctioned is. So, as you mentioned, maritime law is quite complicated and doesn't give very clear answers to in what kind of situations one can do what happened now, like that Finnish Coast Guard and Special Intervention Unit of the police was able to intervene in the boat when it was forced to go off international waters to where Finland has sovereignty over its own waters. So there are difficult questions. In principle, Western countries have been able to restrict things like maritime insurance and other support to these vessels, but their right to roam in international waters is a tougher object for any kind of sanctions. But many maritime legal experts are working on this now, and I don't claim to have the expertise on what legal routes there are. Of course, then comes the more general question to what extent one needs to follow legal routes when there's an adversary that doesn't care about legal routes so much. And this is another level of conversation in Finland and some other countries.
I mean, this is exactly the point. Russia doesn't really care about this, but we still do. Would you perhaps be able to imagine a situation whereby we say, okay, we presume that these incidents, if we still call them like that, are attributable to your activities, Russia. So we actually have your frozen funds. We are going to take away from these funds, not from the proceeds like we do now, but from the funds proper, in order to mitigate and repair any sort of damage inflicted to our infrastructure in the Baltics. How do you feel about it? Of course, Russia is going to protest, but really, do you think that perhaps an option along these lines could actually be taken advantage of in order to deter Russia from inflicting any damage, because it will know that it will automatically have to pay for this?
I'm sure it's one of the options on the table. There are legal complications and more general principled complications there, because on the one hand, for many people in the West, property rights are something that have some unviolable nature. So violating property rights, in case such action would actually legally mean violating property rights, then is a step that not everyone is willing to take, because it's considered to be one of the basic pillars of sort of Western capitalist society. So then one has to balance, like, to what extent doing something about Russia is more important than maintaining sanctity of property rights. And these are questions we have seen before being pondered when the question of Russian frozen funds has come up in several other occasions.
But this is truly shocking, right? Because we consider property to be sacrosanct. Russia, on the other hand, not only doesn't consider property to be anything that it, has to actually comply with, property rights, also borders, right? It has invaded a sovereign country, taken away parts of its territory. That was 2014. Nothing happened. So it continues to do so right now. Basically nibbling away pieces of Ukraine day by day, moving forward, and the West is still paralyzed by questions of, as you're saying, the intricacies of our legal system. Doesn't this place us at a disadvantage?
Well, one could think so. Then comes a question of to what extent it's useful for Western countries to start benchmarking their actions as, okay, Russia violates something, so why don't we violate something too? I don't know, Mongolia violates International Criminal Court's order to detain Putin, so why should we care about international criminal law, and so on and so forth. So I think there are two basic approaches to this. Russia is violating several principles, so let's not obey the principles anymore, or there's the kind of principled road of saying, okay, but these principles of international law are still important and the West should obey them even if other actors don't. And how to balance this is a question many Western decision makers are thinking about. And we've seen examples of violations of international law in both of our countries, in Finland and Poland, for example, in cases of border. So it does happen, and the new kind of benchmarking does happen. And I'm not the one to make decisions or give answers to what the decision makers should do there, but these are their dilemmas.
So do you think that what we can actually count on within the next couple of months would be tougher sanctions on the shadow fleet? I mean, the shadow fleet is also an environmental hazard. We've seen one of these ships capsizing in the Black Sea, causing massive damage to the environment.
Certainly. So now there are like three different things that play in some sense. One is whether the shadow fleet operators are cutting cables, as we suspect has happened now, whether they bring funds for Russia to continue doing war in Ukraine or something, some call hybrid warfare somewhere else, which is clearly happening. And then the environmental risks that are high. These vessels are normally older and not so well maintained as the traditional Western controlled and insured vessels. These are normally over 15 years old, and therefore the risk of major leaks and environmental damage is bigger. So there are these three different kinds of threats coming and consequences and possible consequences coming out of the shadow fleet. And all three are to be confronted in some sense, but it's some are more difficult to confront than the other ones, especially trying to stop it totally in international waters.
So in the meantime, should we perhaps resort to escorting all these vessels, maintaining surveillance, using drones, for example? I know it's expensive, but again, you could say, well, all these expenses will be deducted from the frozen Russian funds, if necessary.
That's one option that's been on the table, like saying that there would be obligatory sort of following of and escorting of the ships, and whether it's ship owners or whether it's Russian frozen funds that should pay for it is, I've seen two kinds of proposals there. Of course, one could say that in last instance, many of these ships are in practice owned by Russia, perhaps by Lukoil or some other Russian state-related operator, but legally and on paper they may have different kinds of owner structures, and getting payments for this is complicated. But then again, if you say, okay, you can't enter, let's say, the Baltic Sea area unless you are escorted by someone and it costs so and so much, then if that can be done legally, that could be one option. And I don't know about the legal details.
Professor Teivo Teivainen was our guest today here on TVP World. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Still very much an ongoing issue that has to be examined further. So thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us for more latest news and updates.